People were attracted to Detroit like they're attracted any place else where there's money and a possibility of better living conditions or better ways of supporting their families. The blacks were attracted to Detroit for many reasons. Well, I won't say many, but for one particular reason. At that time, the exodus was taking place from the South, if you remember. And this was right after World War I. A lot of black servicemen had returned to the South, even though they'd been fight for democracy and all of that, and they didn't find it. And with the Industrial Revolution beginning right after the World War I, and the opening of jobs in the industrial areas, especially here in the city of Detroit, blacks and a lot of Southern whites were lured to Detroit because of the possibility of getting jobs, number one, and getting better conditions to live for number two. You got to go back a little bit in my family. I was originally born in South Carolina. My father was a fireman on a train in South Carolina. A white man would not fire a train in the South at that time. That was below his dignity to be a fireman on a train. The white persons in the engine would only be there as an engineer to run the train. I had an uncle living in Columbus, Ohio, and my uncle had told my father about how much money he could make by coming to Columbus, Ohio. Instead of firing a train, they could probably get a job in Columbus, Ohio, firing a train. Lo and behold, when he got in Ohio, they wouldn't hire blacks to fire a train in Columbus. It was vice versa from what it was in the South. That was a job that no black could have. And after we settled in Ohio for some time, about 5 years, my daddy had been working as a construction worker. And he and my mother came over to Detroit one weekend to see a cousin of his on what you call excursion. They would run excursion trains from Columbus, Ohio, to Detroit. And most people were coming to get some Canadian whiskey, liquor, you know. At that time, they were talking about, well, go to the Motor City and you can get a whiskey from Canada. My mom and daddy, neither one of them drank at the time. But anyway, he had a cousin working here, and somehow he convinced my father that he could make more money here in Detroit than he could in Columbus. And my father, back and forth on the weekends, he and my mother would come over. So finally, he decided to come over and give it a trial run. And that trial run resulted about 3 or 4 months later in my mother and father moving to Detroit. That's what brought me to Detroit, Michigan. We were all going to school. You got to remember, I came from a large family with 7 boys and 2 girls. And he would write letters back home, and then finally he came home on the weekend. He got us all together, and he told us he and my mother had decided to move to Detroit because of the money involved, and we could get he could get better pay, and all of us could be going to school here in the city of Detroit, which would make it better, and how much money his cousin was making over here. I didn't want to come. In fact, when my older brother, out of the 7 boys, I'm between the first 3 and the last 3. 2 girls were older than all of us. None of us seemed to want to come at the time, but my uncle had a lot of kids our age. But we finally decided, and he broke it to us that, no, this is upsetting again, but I think it would be better if all of us stay together. Let's go to Detroit. There I can get a job paying much more money. You can go to school there. There's possibilities after you get out of school. You can get jobs with General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, and that's where the bulk of the black people are. Well, the word was Negro people at that time, or colored people. There was some hesitancy on the part of my older brother, the 2 older brothers, to come. But anyway, we came. And my father did get a job, and he was making $5 a day. That was some big money. And I ran away 3 times going back to Ohio. I didn't like Detroit. Last time I ran away, I had 6 cents in my pocket over in Toledo, Ohio, going back to Columbus, Ohio on November 11th. And my daddy, state police called him, told him, come over and get this guy. My daddy told me, it's the 3rd time you ran away. I'm taking you back to Detroit, and if you do it again, blah, blah, blah. And I heeded my daddy's advice and stayed here. And that was the beginning of my full-time residency here in the city of Detroit. Well, to know what happened in Detroit in 1929, you would have to live here in 1929 to see what happened. In fact, all hell broke loose. The bottom dropped out. That was the beginning of the Depression. People call it the Great Depression. Banks closed. They were run on banks. People who had some savings began to go to banks and put money they had out. People who were living, we call it that time, high on the hog, middle class and the upper class, they began to be the first ones to get to the banks. And as a result of that, the Depression set in. The factories began to lay off. People became unemployed. And you had a lot of suicides here in Detroit, people committing suicides because they'd lost their money. And from 1929 on, it got worse. It didn't get any better. It got worse. And some of the trials and tribulations that people had to go through during that Depression, sometimes I even be a little reluctant to talk about it, because being an eyewitness to it and to survive it and still be around bring back some hell of a bitter recollections and memories. If you would walk down the streets in Detroit in 1930, you would see people standing on street corners. You would see people, few people having apples on the corner selling them. You would see people discussing what should be done. You would hear people saying the leadership in Washington wasn't worth a damn. You would hear people say, where in the hell is the chicken in every pot and the garage, 2 cars in every garage? And you would hear them discussing, let's form our own party. The Republicans or Democrats aren't worth a damn. You would hear, you would go see people on street corners holding meetings, or in a lot holding meetings. Each and every group who that leader was speaking to, that leader had his own opinion about how to survive, or what the country was not doing and what it was doing. You saw people hungry. You saw young men and women, parents who could no longer afford to send them to school. You saw people going up in alleys looking in garbage cans to find what you could, what was eatable. You saw people being evicted from their home because of non-payment of rent, or because non-payments of mortgages, paying on their home if they were buying it. You saw people discussing ways and means of, at that time, say, let's march on Washington. You saw veterans who'd been in World War I going to the veteran post, the American Legion post, and saying that they had been betrayed. You saw church people asking you to come to church and pray to God for salvation and relieve this way of living, or the plague that had been brought on them. Then you saw people saying that we're not going to take this anymore as the Depression went on. then you begin to see formations of different organizations. You had the hate groups, you had the togetherness groups, you had the veterans groups, you had beginning of the formation of the unemployment councils. Detroit in 1928 and Detroit in 1930 and 31 was a hell of a lot of different. People were working in 1928. And in 1929, that's when it hit. In 1930, from 1929 on, that's when the Depression hit, and it was downhill. 1928, everybody was working. People were living door to door each other. And, there was a lot of social gatherings going on. The parks were filled every Sunday and Saturday afternoon. You had the theaters going, and you had the burlesque going. You had the speakeasies going. You know what a speakeasy is? Or you heard of them, no doubt. You know, that was before Prohibition, if you remember. And you could go to one of these joints and knock on the door, and the guy look out, and if you're all right, you come in and you can buy yourself some beer or some alcohol beverages. And you had the big bands, you had the dance halls. Detroit was a hell of a town. It was real good. It was the different nationalities were living close together. There was no outbursts of racism. See, everybody seemed to was congealed to a certain extent that it was one of these things that you could consider to a certain extent we are brother's keeper, you know. But then 1929, when the Depression hit, from then on, it was a different Detroit altogether from a standpoint of unemployment and the attitude of the people. When I say Detroit, different altogether from the standpoint of living conditions, unemployment. Henry Ford was important to Detroit in many ways. A lot of people who lived in Detroit worked for Henry Ford. To a certain extent, that was pretty good because of the income. Henry Ford was also a detriment to the city of Detroit because of the conditions in the shop and the way that you had to almost give up your manhood to get a job there. The other one, about the different type of people he employed as the overseers of the Ford plant. Goons who he had hired to prevent unions from coming in, ex-cons he had on as service people. He would get their parole from the different prisons here in Michigan, and he would hire for the sole objective of preventing unions and, quote, to keep order in the plant. He was an individual that I would say in certain ways contributed a lot to the economy. But in contributing to the economy, he took that back by doing, as I said before, preventing unions, had a financial stranglehold on the city of Detroit and, to a certain extent, the city of Dearborn and some of the outlying communities. Because if you got to remember, Henry Ford was the first one to offer $5 a day. And that was a hell of a lot of money at that time. And when that was announced, you had people coming from everywhere to work for Ford Motor Company. The difference is, the question you asked, the bottom line is from 1928 to 1930 and on, from 1930 on till the war began, was that financially from 1928 to 1930, Henry Ford was, I would say, a key figure in the economy of the city of Detroit. He ran Dearborn. Everybody who, well, not everybody, he had a lockhole, financial lockhole on Dearborn, and he dictated the policies of what the city of Dearborn should do and when they do it and how they do it. And he had laws passed where you couldn't pass out any literature on the streets of Dearborn. He financially, by paid taxes to the city of Dearborn, he controlled it. All Henry Ford wanted from Detroit was a hell of a manpower to work in his plant. And he would like to have also controlled Detroit politically. But to a certain extent that did happen. Most certainly he had people in high places in Detroit, elected people in high places in Detroit, who catered to Henry Ford, who bowed to his wishes. But in the main, I think most of the politicians were, to a certain extent, independent and far beyond what the politicians in the city of Dearborn were to Henry Ford. Well, he got by just like any other family had to get by. We would, as you remember, back at that time, they didn't have gas furnaces. You burned coal to keep your house warm in the wintertime. All of us would go out during the winter to shovel snow off sidewalks, to haul ashes out of basement of people, 15 cents. 15 cents was a hell of a lot of money. Shovel a whole sidewalk and carry out all the ashes out of a basement and dump them in the alley. We would go to the market to help the farmers unload their food. We would jump on a train to keep warm in the wintertime, a freight train that was loaded with coal going down the railroad over here on the east side. And we would throw off coal, take home, and challenge the railroad detectives. Not only my family did it, all families did it, black and white families. And that's what I think is missing today. The black and white families at that time was, they was under the same roof. Nobody could claim I'm better than you because of my income, because everybody was getting kicked in the rear because of depression at the time. And they had to acknowledge that. Their own appearance showed it. Their living conditions showed it. Their homes showed it. And you got to remember there were 7 husky boys in my family, and just only 2 girls. And it was hard. I left home along with my brothers sometime when my mama would cook dinner just to make it possible for my younger brothers, my sisters, my mom and dad to eat. I wouldn't eat. My other brothers do the same. I was hungry as hell. But my mother and my dad realized, they said, come back, sit at the table and come on and eat. I said, well, no, I'm going down to Brewster Center, down to the gym and work out. We played basketball in the wintertime, played baseball on the playground in the summertime, but hungry as hell. But what we would do, the Eastern Market wasn't too far, it's not too far from here. They say all the apples that had been injured that the farmers would discard, try to sell them, well, we'd take them, take that rotten part off and eat the good part, bring it home and peel it and have your mother make some apple jelly or make some fruit out of it and boil it or fry it or whatever, with potatoes the same way. Now you got to remember, we still had Grosse Pointe. Grosse Pointe was and still is the financial uptight and upper crust part of the city of Detroit. You had millionaires living there, but they also had their trials and tribulations because the income that they'd been accustomed to was not as great as it had been, but they were still living 100,000% better than we were, but they needed our services. The services included, again, I would repeat that, cutting their lawns in the summer, having your mother, your sister doing domestic work for them, or your father chauffeuring for them. My mother never did do any domestic work. My father never did do any chauffeuring. And I think that was because my mother had a large family. We were proud that we were able to have her stay home with us, and we would do the work, whatever we could get. You got to remember, the cost of living was so far down, it wasn't high like it is. You could get a quart of milk for 4 cents. You could get a dozen eggs for 3 cents. You could get a slab of bacon like that for 35 cents, a slab of bacon. But where in the hell was you going to get the 4 cents? Where was you going to get the 35 cents? That was the big question. You know? You could get a steak dinner for 40 cents. You could get a rib steak, mashed potatoes and gravy, cup of coffee, apple pie, and ice cream on it for 40 cents. That was a big deal. You asked how we got by? That was how we got by. I was standing in front of the old Roxy Theater on Woodward Avenue, and the parade itself was, again, an indication of the satisfaction of the people with the situation they had to live under. And I think it was not only dissatisfaction, but it inspired many people to move on, or try to move on to see what else could be gained by being together. Of course, at that time, as I say, Detroit was a city of despair, a city of uncertainty, a city of many ethnic groups, a city who seemed the promises that seemed to have existed before had completely gone. And the question is, where the hell do we go from here? The question was at that time, where do we go from here? Well, as you know, as I indicated before, so many people were unemployed. They had no kind of financial income at all. They didn't have any finances for food. They didn't have any finances for clothes. They didn't have any finances for medical care. They didn't have any financial aid for any kind of support at all. And especially those people who were renters at the time. And the landlords, they were suffering also. The homeowners who are the property owners, I put it, who owned these homes that were being rented to people, they were being pushed to pay taxes. They didn't have a damn thing to pay taxes with. In turn, they pushed the people who they were renting these places to pay the rent. And in turn, those people couldn't pay the rent because they didn't have any money coming in to pay the rent. So what would happen, they would go to the courts and get eviction notices, permits rather, to evict these people. And the evictions was something real bad to see. January, when you see families being sit out in snow, 3 and 4 and 5 inches of snow, and with the mother holding maybe a 2-month-old baby, a 3-month-old baby, and the others cluttered around her and her husband. And it was hard as hell for people to take. This went on for some time, and out of that came some resistance. And the resistance came from a lot of people in the neighborhood. When I remember the first one I saw, I didn't know what the hell it was all about, but we were behind on our rent, 5 months behind at the time. And they had evicted a family and blocked it up where I lived. And so one of the guys said, well, let's send them back in. They wanted to beat the hell out of the process service at the time, but they said, look, I'm getting 75 cents to do this. That's what they were paying these guys, 75 cents to go out to evict you. And I don't give a damn what you do after I leave, but that's what we decided to do. After they would leave, we'd go put the people back in. And that began to spread, not only in our block, all over the east side. And the police at that time was paying the police officers $23 a week in script. They wasn't getting paid in American money. The policemen were being paid in script. So they had a hell of a hard way to go. So we decided that every time they said anybody out in our neighborhood, we was going to put them back in the house. That's what we did. And that's how I got involved with the unemployment councils. Most of the people who were doing this were men or young men whose fathers belonged to it, or mothers and fathers belonged to the unemployment council, or some of the leaders of the unemployment council, but mostly it was just neighbor supporting a neighbor. If your family was being evicted, we'd say, what the hell are you doing here? We would challenge those people who was in it. But again, I repeat that they had a work to do, and they were victims themselves. Some of those who were sitting out people had got notices themselves. So it grew and grew and grew to we had a situation here in Detroit that as fast as they would evict people, we would put them back in. And the police, as what they were, they would turn their head sometime and go the other way. They wouldn't try to put you back in. So what would happen, you would be what they call challenge an order of the court, or you would be in violation of a court order. But the same judge who gave that eviction notice, he himself had to get elected by these people here in the city of Detroit when election time came. And he was a little hesitant to send you to jail, you know, and because he wanted to make that little buck what he was making to retain that job. But all in all, I would say the evictions that took place on the east side of Detroit was one that if you could have, some documentation or movies could have been made of it, would have been worth $1 million today to see some of the young men and women. You had young men and women who formed brigades to help go back and set people back in their homes. And that's how people stayed. So finally what happened, the people who owned the homes, they couldn't keep up the mortgages on it, so they lost them because they couldn't pay the mortgages, the owners couldn't. The people who were renting couldn't pay the rent. The city, who was expecting money from the owner to pay taxes on that home, wasn't getting any money. And the policeman who was supposed to be enforcing the law, it had been ordered by the judge to not to let these people, he was reluctant to do it because he himself was facing eviction. What the hell could he do with $23 a week in script, not in American money now? He had to take that money to a grocery store, that script to a grocery store, to buy groceries or buy him a pair of shoes or buy his wife a dress or his kids something to eat. So that was the beginning of possibility, a hell of a revolution, not in the city of Detroit, but all over this country. And I don't think it was just confined to Detroit, but Detroit was one hell of a place at that time. Well, Murphy was a good guy because to know why Frank Murphy was a good guy, he himself had seen his people persecuted in Ireland. Frank Murphy saw the British Army drag some of his relatives behind a horse when he was in Ireland growing up. And I think that had a bearing on Mayor Murphy for many, many years, in fact, up until he died. And once he was elected mayor of the city of Detroit, in his own way, I think he tried to send a message to the people of the city of Detroit about how he felt personally about the plight, the hardships, and all of the things that they had to live under, and the families, the non-financial conditions they had. And definitely he was a good governor. You know, he went on to be governor of the state of Michigan. And while he was mayor of the city of Detroit, I think the people began to see in Murphy some of the things that they would like to have seen happen if he could do some things for them. But the city of Detroit was broke, didn't have any money, just like any other city around, you know. And what little federal help was coming in was not enough to even make a dent for the unemployed people and the people who were living here in Detroit. You didn't have any federal programs like you have now. You didn't have any kind of medical care. You didn't have any support for pregnant mothers. You did not have any Social Security. You didn't have any Medicare. You didn't have any social service agencies who's going to give you some help. And what had the welfare department, they themselves went broke. The city didn't have any money to finance the department anymore. So Detroit, that's why I say they had to resort to scrip. They didn't have any more money. And the only money they had was left in Detroit was what a few banks stayed open and what money the big shots had out in Grosse Pointe. And it was one of those cases then where a few had all of it, and the many didn't have a damn thing. Well, yeah, as I indicated before, I got involved in when I got involved with these evictions. And the unemployment council was just what the word say, unemployed, you know, because so many people had been affected by the plants closings and the depression. They were unemployed. And the unemployment council was saying that this was needless. Why can't we be working? We're willing to work. We can make some money, we can spend some money. But it went beyond just unemployment, you know, discussions at the council. You know, they got into the political part of it, the individuals who was holding public office come under either praise or attack. And finally it was one of these got to a point where let's all of the unemployment councils get together and merge from all parts of the city. And somewhere down the road, let's put on one hell of a display. Let's march on Ford. Let's march on General Motors. Let's march on Chrysler. Let's march on Thompson Products. Let's show our strength by the togetherness, by letting them know that we've had it, and we're going to show them that together we're going to get something, you know. Then you had all kind of different individuals who was espousing their thoughts about it. Some were Marxists, some were socialists, some were Democrats, some were dissatisfied Republicans, some were just individuals. Some were veterans from World War I, you know. And, but all of them had an objective. And that objective was why and what can we do to eliminate this situation that we all are confronted with. And the answer to that was, in my opinion, was when he decided that he was going to put on this march. And a lot of people's amazement, they did not think it would be involving the number of people that was involved. You had people who wasn't involved with the unemployment councils who took part in the march. But to their credit, by block and by neighborhood, the unemployment councils were so effective, practically everybody knew each other. And by just knowing each other, and you say the Janenes knew the Joneses, the Washington knew the Stokowskis, the Stokowskis knew the Altmans knew the Gonzales, the Gonzales knew the, it was on and on, a mixture of ethnics and different nationalities, different religions, different colors, different neighborhoods, all of them confronted with the same thing. And to this day, I give the unemployment councils much credit for bringing to the attention and galvanizing and organizing the people in the city of Detroit to have some kind of way of expressing themselves and try to reach some goal that brings to the attention of the powers that be at that time in Washington, D.C., that this was a warning. This is a day that you're going to remember. We're going to have a day that you're going to remember. Whether it's today or whether it's tomorrow, you're going to recognize or you're going to understand or you're going to see some things that you don't believe that we will be willing to do to make this a better place to live. And that took place. Yeah, well, as some time ago I told you, you had all kind of individuals who were good speakers. And I don't think they were good just because they had went to school to take public speaking. I think they were damn good because the conditions they had to live under. They were giving their own opinions about how their families suffered. And they didn't have to give it because everybody knew it anyway. And when you take a group of people, I don't give a damn who they are, who've been subjected to unemployment, no income, and seeing their families suffer over a period of time, the string is going to snap somewhere. And the meetings they used to have at Grand Circus Park, the meetings they had at the different neighborhoods, Polish neighborhood, all of them began to get together. And when that happened, on one meeting at my group of the Unemployment Council on Erskine and Hastings Street here in the city of Detroit, a resolution was put forward by a guy named Nelson Davis that we ask all the unemployment councils to join in a mass demonstration. Well, nobody thought it would have the effect that it did, but I don't think it was the resolution itself that did it. I think it was just the attitude and the minds of the people. And out of that came an agreement all over the city that they would have a march. And this march would be on Ford Motor Company for jobs. And it took place, 1932. But the history of that march and the people who suffered, the people who died, the people who were injured, the people who were put in jail, drew the attention not only nationwide, but I think worldwide, because if you remember, there were 5 or 6 people who got killed in that march, not because they did anything wrong, not because they had destroyed anything, not because they had fought anyone, but because the Ford Motor Company saw fit to stop it by bullets and clubs, and that's what they tried to do. I don't know whether you ever saw any pictures of that march on Miller Road and what took place on that day, but the outcome of that march, all kind of estimates were given, 75,000, 100,000, 120,000. I don't know how many it was, but I know there were many. Every nationality, every political line of thinking, every religious line of thinking were put aside. There was no division on I'm black, I'm white, I'm Protestant, I'm Catholic. The objective was to demonstrate before the Ford Motor Company that the conditions that the people of the city of Detroit and the suburbs, you had people from Melvindale, you had people from Lincoln Park, you had people from Highland Park, you had people from Hamtramck. These are all suburbs of the city of Detroit. I don't know whether you know about them. Converged on the Ford Motor Company. March all the way from Detroit to Dearborn, cross Dearborn line into the city of Dearborn and onto the plant there on Miller Road. But the brutality that the Ford Motor Company resorted to was something that will always remember, will always be in my mind, you know. There was a guy named Harry Bennett. He had unquestioned power. He had unchallenged power. And he had power far beyond the imagination of many people. And that power had been given to him by Henry Ford himself. And it was a brutal system that they had. And the answer to any resentment or any kind of challenge to the Ford Motor Company. Why you paid with your life in some instances. Or you got the hell beat out you physically in some instances. And that was a real, when you ask how did he have the power, who had the power? Well, the power was bestowed to him by Henry Ford himself. Harry Bennett ran the service department for the Ford Motor Company. He was a ruthless, damn no good son of a bitch. He's dead and gone, and I don't know whether he went to heaven or hell, but if he's down there in the furnace room, I hope he's burned. Well, the march itself started in many communities. Primarily, it was in the city of Detroit. Ferry and Rivard Street, where most you had up there were people from the Ukraine. You had Czechs, you had Romanians, you had many people from the Baltic states. Further down in the city, you had the black neighborhood, Hastings Street, St. Antoine Street, Rivard Street. Then you had the Jewish community. Then you had the Italian community. And actually, the march started here in the city of Detroit. And as they began to move out of Detroit into going through the other areas of the suburbs, like Dearborn, then you had people from what you call the Downriver, Inkster, Ecorse, River Rouge, Dearborn, Lincoln Park, Allen Park, Highland Park, Hamtramck, all joined in. We had no trouble till we got to the city limits of Detroit, going into Dearborn itself, a little place called Baby Creek Park. And there, all of us assembled and going from different parts, and we're going to march up to Miller Road. And when we got to Miller Road and Dix, that's when we were challenged by the service department and the city of Dearborn Police Department. And they told us we couldn't go any further. A quick meeting was held, and but you got to understand there were thousands and thousands of people. I don't know how many there were. Some the newspapers gave all kind of versions of it. 75,000, 100,000, 125,000, 150, all in all. But there were people who had never seen each other before from all of these communities and from the city of Detroit who had joined in the march. And we were challenged at the Miller Road and Dix Avenue by the service department and the Dearborn Police Department. A quick meeting was held, and it was decided that we would march on. As the march began, the Ford Motor Company people opened up with water hoses, and that didn't stop. So another 200 or 300 yards, that's when the gunfire started. And naturally, with thousands of people being involved, and with the police, with the Ford Motor Company people shooting, and the Dearborn Police Department wheeling the clubs and blackjacks and whatnot, naturally people began to retreat like any human being would with gunfire. We didn't have anything. Best thing we had probably was a match and a cigarette. But as the people began to fall, you could see blood. You could see one woman holding a young man in her arms and dying. You could see police grabbing men and women, holding them, beating them. And all in all, it was one hell of a brutal display of terror by the people in the Ford Motor Company's service department and the city of Dearborn Police Department. But the outcome of that was, not only in my opinion, many of us have expressed it since then, the unnecessary brutality that they displayed on that day, with the approval of the third largest corporate giant in the world, and that is the Ford Motor Company at that time. And I say with the approval because damn sure they were representatives and no doubt had the orders from the top management of Ford Motor Company to do exactly what they did, and that was murder, number one. That was brutality, number two. And that was insensitivity to any people, number three, and on and on. But those people who died on Miller Road that day died for a cause. They died because they wanted to see a better country. They died because they knew that in this country where we lived, they should not, and their family should not, have to suffer like they were doing at the time. And they died because they was firmly convinced that somewhere something was wrong. And that day, I grew up to be a man on that time when I saw the blood that was on Miller Road, when I saw those people being shot down. And that day I decided that from then on, whatever it takes, I was going to do whatever I could to correct the situation. Well, I did it. And some people say, not only me, others as well. Some called me a radical. Some called me a communist. Some called me a no good so-and-so and so. But people who brand people with these kind of names, whatnot, people who didn't have to live under these conditions, people who didn't see this brutality take place, people who didn't see women being clubbed like animals, people who didn't see young men in the bloom of their life, 18, 19, and 20, 21 years old, being murdered, openly murdered, there was no resistance, just said we're going to march. And to this day, the blood of those people on the hands of the Ford Motor Company, and the blood that flowed that day between the black and whites on Miller Road brought together a togetherness that still exists in the Ford Motor Company among the workers of the Ford to this day. Many who took part in that march have passed on, but they have sons, they have grandsons, or daughters, or granddaughters. Some of them are still working at the Ford Motor Company today. Those who paid with what the last thing they had, and that is life itself, I don't think their payment was in vain, because it paved the way later on for the Union to get in Fords. And the blood that flowed that day on Miller Road between the black and the white people was blood that banded together the black and white people of the city of Detroit and some of the suburbs, especially those who had been employed by the Ford Motor Company and were laid off, and especially those who later became employees of the Ford Motor Company. And it made possible friendship. But let me go back a little further before I tell you. But and that day, what happened that day paved the way later on for the Union to get in Fords. Because if it had not been for that march and the people who participated in the march and the people who survived the march, I do not think the Ford Motor Company would have been organized by the Union as quickly as it was. Because if you remember, Ford was the last one of the big three to be organized. General Motors was organized first, Chrysler was second, and Ford, we organized General Motors back in 1937. And it took us all the way from 1937 to 1941 to organize Ford. Chrysler came back. But the people who survived that march and the participation that they engaged in later on to help bring the Union into Ford, into the Ford plant, made it possible for a lot of other people to be where they are today. And it was the blood that flowed between the black and white on Miller Road that day set up a bond of friendship between the blacks and the white in the Ford plant that still exists today to some extent. Because out of organizing Ford Motor Company, the Rouge plant, there also came organization of Local 600. And you still see in Local 600 the brotherhood, the tranquility, the friendship, and the togetherness of whites and blacks that you'd never see in a place throughout the whole UAW in this country. You'll never see that kind. For Ford Local 600, through its black and white membership, pioneered many progressive things. Well, you got to understand, at that time, Herbert Hoover was a president that had no consideration for the people at all. As I indicated before, Hoover didn't seem to give a damn about the plight of the people. And Henry Ford didn't seem to give a damn about the plight of the people. Only when he did, it was to his advantage, not to the people's advantage. And the relationship between Ford and Hoover at the time was such that during the time that Hoover was president, that they had much in common. They had much in common from a standpoint that Hoover did not do anything to have Ford Motor Company as president of the United States to say, well, we're gonna, if you're gonna lay off people like this, the federal government will try to do something to help you. What can we do? And Ford didn't ask for a damn thing. And I don't think it was necessary for him to ask for anything because of the relationship he had with President Hoover at the time. I don't know, I can't give you any authentic answer about what knowledge I have that they were close friends. I don't know. I can only go by what I witnessed at the time and the experiences I had to go through at the time when both of them were at the height of their power. He being the president and Ford being the owner of Ford Motor Company. He didn't do anything from a federal level to help the unions get into Ford. He didn't do anything from a federal level to protect the workers of Ford Motor Company. He didn't do anything from a federal level to offer anything to the veterans who were in World War and who were employed at the Ford Motor Company at the time. In fact, the veterans themselves, as you mentioned a little while ago, they had to demonstrate themselves by going to Washington, and you know what happened there. MacArthur just ruthlessly beat the hell out of them. And many of those veterans who went to Washington were also former employees of the Ford Motor Company. And answer to your question, in my own thinking, yeah, I think there were close friends of understanding to preserve the status quo and to not do anything that they thought would help better the situation. I don't have any proof on my own that of this, but action speaks louder than words. I know probably you've seen some of the headlines of the Detroit Times at that time. The Detroit Times was owned solely, hook, line, and sinker by a guy named Randolph Hearst. And Randolph Hearst has never been friends of the working people. But they had to question whether it was necessary that the brutality had been waged by the service people of Ford Motor Company and the Devon Police Department, was it necessary they had to resort to this kind of brutality to the people who was in the march. Then the Ford made the accusation, some of them made the accusation that all of these people were communist. Well, Henry Ford had said the communists had tried to take over his plant. And the newspapers played that up to a certain extent. But there were three newspapers here at that time. There were Detroit Times, the Free Press, and the News. Two of them are still in existence now. There's the News and the Free Press. The Times closed some years ago. But the press, the question you asked was what was the reaction of the press? The press reaction was mixed. Whether these people were trying to take over the Ford Motor Company plant, or whether they were just ordinary working people who were seeking some answer to the unemployment problem. As I indicated, the Times said that they questioned whether it was necessary for the Ford Motor Company to resort to the measures that they did in taking away the lives of these people. But the press being what they were at that time, naturally, we didn't get I don't think we got any favorable publicity other than that one statement made by the Detroit Times at the particular time that questioned whether it was necessary for this kind of action to be taken, and whether the government was going to interfere. The press being the press like they are, they're no different, in my opinion, what they are now. They will always side with the powers that be. The press will always try to stick to the status quo. You may find some individuals who write for the press may take a little different line once in a while, and like what was at that time. But in the main, the press didn't do anything to help the cause, other than mention about was it necessary to resort to this kind of action. Yeah. To play the International at the funeral. Yeah. I never have said, even up to this day, that there wasn't some communist there. And I won't back off of that because some people who admitted they were communists gave leadership. They helped organize the march. They was involved in the unemployment councils. And there were other people who were not communists who gave leadership and who was involved in the unemployment council. There were many people in that march didn't even know how to spell the word communist at that time. There were individuals in that march who were preachers. There were church people in that march. There were workers in that march. There were women in that march. There were men in that march. There were kids in that march. And if they played the International, which they did, what the hell that had to do with it, if they played the International? If they played the International from a standpoint that this was something of togetherness, that all people who were being oppressed, all people who were pushed aside, all people who were denied, all people who were seeking a better way of life. What's the difference in playing the International? Because at that time, I think most of the people didn't have any faith in playing the national anthem. The national anthem had been played over and over again, but the conditions still existed. And I don't say just because the International was played, it was going to better their condition. But you got to also remember that the national anthem was played also. There's a lot of people don't mention that. They want to make hay out of the fact that, well, the International was played, and this must have been sponsored or been a part of a world revolution that was advocated by Russia. That came into play. All of that was said. But out of those thousands of people there, if all of them had been communist, I'm damn sure it would have been a different situation than what it was. And nobody can tell me that all of those people who took part in that march were all communists. I'm going to say yes, some were, and they openly admitted that they were. Some were not, and some were opposed to the communists in that march. Opposed to them because of, number one, because of the political aspect, but not from the objective itself. And they would express themselves that way. But to try to make hay of this because the International was played as a justification to protect the Ford Motor Company, those people don't know what the hell it was all about. Who would those people who would make that kind of statement? If indeed that was the cause of them making a statement, to say that the International, inasmuch as the International was played, that all of these people were communists. No, I don't buy that. Well, a few minutes after the gunfire opened up, I saw Joe turn and hold his chest and fall to the ground. And I went over, another guy in there, Chris Alston, and I went over to Joe. And Chris put his arm under his head, and all I could remember seeing Joe's eyes blink like this and this, his head drop. And it was something that to see a friend of yours pass out like that, it was real bad. People began to scream, and I saw other guys begin to fall. And I saw a black woman holding Coleman Lenny in her arms. Coleman had been shot also, and he died there on Miller Road. And people began to scream and holler, "Go away, go away." And they got guns, they got guns. And to witness people being shot down in the presence of you is not a good thing. I could see if it was in time of war, maybe, and you'd been prepared for it. I could see if it was some hostility that you know you were going into and expect some kind of a fight back from whoever you were confronting, but not expecting it. And to see people you'd been acquainted with and friends of dropping at your feet is not a good experience. And it's hard to talk about it, but I guess sometimes it's necessary to let people know what actually happened there. And I appreciate you asking me the question because I feel as though that even at this late date, the people should know actually what happened in that march on Ford Motor Company in 1932. I don't claim to have all the answers as to what happened there. I can only speak for what I saw and what I experienced. And what I saw and what I experienced, I hold it totally against the Ford Motor Company to this day. And I will never forgive them. And I will never forget the people who gave their lives that day to make it possible for this country, as the city of Detroit, would have a better way of governing the people, and to be a better way for people to understand and to live together. And also never forget that, to me, again, it was the opening day for the Union to come into Ford, because it did later on, some years later. And to those who did die on Miller Road that day, we owe them a debt that we will never be able to pay, because they gave all they had, and that is life itself, to make it possible for some of us to survive. I was an honor guard, yeah. Hundreds of people passed, thousands of people passed the caskets at the hall up on Ferry and Ravat. And the funeral procession was long. Many thousands of people participated in the funeral. You had expressions of sympathy coming from many, many different people. You had, the press was there, and the families of those who were the victims of the Ford Motor Company's attack were both black and white, and it brought that funeral was a real sad affair. The sidewalks was crowded. The many friends of those who even were not at the march showed up. And it'll be a day of remembrance, especially those of us who are still around, that make us know that what those guys did and the things that they wanted to see happen. Some of the people are reaping the benefits of it today, because if it had not been for them, I don't think this town would have been the town that it turned out to be later on, because the people were prepared to, not only here in Detroit, to do something real drastic. I don't think that we'd, as a country, that we'd have had the same way of governing ourselves as we have today if it had not. I think that the people, whether it would have been good or bad, I do not know, but the people were, in this town, and I believe other places as well, were prepared and organizing to do some things on their own, because they could not continue to live under the conditions that the federal government and the corporations had imposed on them. It was a day of sadness in this town on the day of that funeral. Well, I mentioned before it had a hell of a financial effect on the city, because a lot of people who lived in Detroit were employees of the Ford Motor Company. And when he closed the plant, naturally that had economic effect on not only the people who had been laid off, but on the city as a whole. And it didn't improve, it got worse, because they had no other place to go. Chrysler wasn't hiring, General Motors wasn't hiring. In fact, they began to lay off themselves. And as you got to remember, this was an auto-industrial town. There was no other economy here. This whole town was built around automobiles. And if you wasn't an auto worker, you, in a plant where they made the automobile, you were working in a place where they made parts for the automobiles. And you could see the effect that what Ford did. And depending on some of the parts, glass and different places like that, tires, all of it began to suffer. Some of the plants who supplied the Ford Motor Company, who supplied General Motors, they had to lay off. But what you had was an area of starvation. What you had was an area in a time of deprivation. What you had was an area of time of non-care on the part of the federal government, and to a certain extent the city government, because the city government could only do so much without the help of the federal government. And as a result, it had an effect on everybody that lived in the city of Detroit. In fact, it boiled down, just a few had every damn thing, and the many didn't have anything. That's what it had. It just was where to survive, you had to be strong, you had to suffer, you had to see your family be deprived of certain things. You had to beg, or you had to plead, you had to ask, and you were denied in most cases. But again, I repeat, it was the many didn't have anything, and the few had it all. The money was tied up just by a few people, not only, especially here in Detroit. It was the auto barons who had the money. The auto barons and the property owners, they had the money. And when Ford laid off, they held theirs. The auto barons held their money, and the people who were depending on them for survival and for financial income didn't have anything. And I go back again, you didn't have any federal agencies looking out for you now. Joe York was a typical young, energetic young man who came along at the time of the Depression. I got acquainted with Joe during the unemployment councils. And Joe was one of the first guys that I got acquainted with by helping people back into their homes after they were evicted. And I struck up a relationship with he and that lasted up until his death. In fact, on the march, Joe and I, from time to time, was marching together on our way to the Ford Motor Company. And he was a guy that color didn't mean anything to him, and he demonstrated that in many ways. He and I and Chris Alston, another young black guy, Chris is still alive today, struck up a friendship where we always did some things to help the people, and Joe went out his way to do things, such as if he had anything that he thought other people could share in, he would do it. For example, Joe would be throwing coal off the freight trains over on the Pier Market Railway, put them in a basket, and he'd come back through the neighborhood and share that coal with some of the neighbors in the neighborhood, take the rest of it home. I used to see him help elderly people across the street. And again, I emphasize this, it wasn't white people, it was black people, even though Joe was white himself. He would try to do things to help people who couldn't help themselves. And he was a guy that always, in my opinion, that wanted to see things better for people and to see things better for those who wanted to see things better. I don't know what I can say other than to say he was a man of the people at that time, a young man in the bloom of his life, just because life just began to bloom. And if he had have lived, if he hadn't been murdered, I think he could have made a lot of contributions to the city of Detroit for his understanding of people and his interest in better living conditions for the people, and also his thoughts about togetherness of all people. Not only he, but the others who was murdered on that day were young men that most of us had the same problems. there were no different problems whether you were black or whether you're white. All of us were faced with the same problems. And Joe's willingness to participate and to defy the guns of the Ford Motor Company was indeed, to me, an act that will live forever for those who saw what happened on that day. And to give up his life, or his life to be taken by the Ford Motor Company like it was, had a bearing on many of us who survived that march. And out of that, we were determined that those who died that day, they did not die in vain. We was going to do everything we could to carry on in the tradition that Joe York, Coleman Lenny, and the Curtis Williams and the others who died did not die in vain, but we're going to do whatever we could to make it possible that their dream would live on. And I know it lived on because we organized the plant later on, and the conditions did change.